Welcome to the second video in our series on Roland Barthes' work Mythologies from 1957. In this video, we're going to look at a few more examples from the first half of the book, and these are Romanness, Operation Margarine, and Striptease. And I should add a little caveat here in that I'm not promoting Striptease, we're just analyzing this as a cultural phenomenon. So as we look at these three examples, it's helpful to know a tiny bit of theory, which Barthes doesn't get to until the second half of the book, but we should introduce some of that here. When we're talking about signs, we typically talk about what's called the signifier. Okay, so the signifier. And an example of that would be, let's say, the word flag. Oops, there we go, flag. Let's add another quotation mark. And this is really a sound. So as soon as we hear that sound in our mind, we're going to have some kind of concept or signified. And all of this goes right back to Ferdinand de Saussure, whom we mentioned in the first video. So the signified in this case is this concept, and you can kind of imagine a flag in your mind. And if we put all of this together, okay, so kind of put a box around it, there we go, then we can call this the sign. All right. So that's fairly straightforward. We can add other details. We can say, well, this refers to something out in the real world. So presumably there's an actual flag somewhere, and we call that the referent, right? We're referring to something. But this is really the start of semiotics, or the study of signs. Now, what Barthes does is he basically suggests that when we're dealing with cultural analysis, what we typically do is we take a sign, so let's say the sign flag, okay, so we'll call this sign 1. All of this here is sign 1. And what starts to happen is that sign 1 becomes the sign, it becomes the signifier for another signified. Okay, so in other words, sign 1 means something else. It has a secondary meaning. And that secondary meaning might be, let's say in the case of a flag, it might be patriotism. So I feel really proud about my country. As soon as I see a flag, I go, wow, this makes me want to fight for my country. What you can see there then is that sign 1, right, becomes the signifier for the second meaning, which becomes the new signified. And the basic point here is that signs point to other signs. Signs are complicated, and one sign means something else. And that's really what happens with cultural analysis, that if you see something like margarine, let's say, we can say, well, margarine is the word, right? And then in our mind, it conjures up an image of something. But margarine itself as a sign starts to mean an entirely different thing. And we'll get to that in a little while. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense. You'll hear more about this as we actually get to the second half of the book, but this should be enough to introduce this particular video. So our first sign then, our first focus here is on the notion of Romanness, the Romans in film, which is one of the chapters in the book. And what Barthes focuses on specifically is this fringe, right? This sort of this hairdo, which you see in a lot of Hollywood films. So what we have then is the fringe. Okay, that's sign number 1, right? The signifier and the signified. What does it mean? Well, it's some kind of shorthand for Romanness, being Roman. If you're making a film and you need to show that your actors are Roman, you just give them a certain haircut and it works out just fine. According to Barthes, this seems kind of fake, and he writes at one point, for the French, the sign in this case overshoots the target and discredits itself by letting its aim appear clearly. It's too clear, right? It's so obvious that it's artificial, and you kind of go, isn't that kind of silly? Now, he adds other examples as well. Another one would be sweating. So the actors in the story of Julius Caesar, they're all sweating profusely, except for Caesar himself. And what does this mean? Well, it means that they are thinking a great deal. They are all tormented in their thought, right? Horribly tormented. They're showing internal debate, and the sweat actually signifies this, at least according to Barthes. Now, Barth himself is a little bit condescending here. He says only a nation of businessmen, right, the US basically, would need a sign like this because apparently Americans don't think very much, whereas the French probably do, according to him. So they need these kinds of artificial signs, whereas other cultures don't. And he piles it on when he says towards the end, here again, the sign is ambiguous, it remains on the surface, yet does not for all that give up the attempt to pass itself off as depth. So, in other words, this is a surface kind of sign on the surface of your face as well. But it tries to show depth. It tries to show something profound, as if there's some profound thinking going on inside. What you can see here is that Barth reads the sign with a sense of bias, you might say, because he's saying, in this case, as opposed to wrestling, which we looked at in our last video, there the sign was artificial, but it wasn't necessarily all bad, as we saw. It could be somewhat genuine. Here the sign is artificial, but it's pretending too hard to be natural, and so it's insincere, it's duplicitous, it is, and this is the worst word you can use for Barth, it is bourgeois, right? It's typically bourgeois. It has to do with the ruling classes, the dominating classes. Ultimately, this is a Marxist perspective. This perspective is all about imposing a bourgeois ideology. All right, so how do we distinguish then between a sign like wrestling and a sign like a Roman fringe? Why is one so duplicitous and the other one is not judged quite as harshly? That's a question that we probably need to ask here. Our next example here is the chapter on margarine. I've got a nice big bucket here full of this stuff. I don't know if you like margarine or not, if you're more of a butter fan. But Roland Barthes' argument here is that the way in which advertisers used to promote margarine, which seems like a worse form of butter, is through a kind of inoculation. Okay, so an inoculation. And we would be probably more familiar with the word vaccine, but that's basically what he's talking about. So if we have a vaccine, right, and somebody jabs you with something, so let's just draw a little picture here. There we go. There's the needle, make it extra long. So if somebody jabs you with something, the idea is that you get a little bit of the disease, but then you're immune to the rest of it. So you actually feel better. And the way in which this can work with something like margarine is that an advertiser will say, okay, well, let's look at the concept, right? So here's margarine. Okay, now a little bit of it is bad. Okay, so this part is bad. You're not going to love it, but let's start by focusing on that. Right, this is like the vaccine basically. Let's focus on the bad stuff first. Yes, it's not butter, but in the end, it's still good. In fact, it's great. There's an element of surprise here. You'll love it even more once you have had this little bit of a bad taste in your mouth, let's say. So he writes, talking about these commercials, he writes, the episode always begins with a cry of indignation against margarine. A mousse made with margarine? Unthinkable. Margarine? Your uncle will be furious, right? How could you do such a thing? So this logic then of inoculating, of giving this kind of vaccine, basically what Barthes is saying is that this way of dealing with signs is very, very common. And if we wanted to sketch it out, what we're basically saying is that if we have sign 1, which we just looked at, right? So we have sign 1. There we go. And we said this bit was bad. Okay. Then what we go on to is sign 2. And now all of a sudden we forget about this little corner, this bad stuff. And we say, well, actually, this thing is still good, right? Overall, this is still good. And this first sign then prepares us for seeing the second sign, which is really the same thing, in a different light. So if you were to apply this to different concepts, as Barthes does, then you could say, well, let's think about the army. So the army, for instance. Okay, now that's really quite misspelled there, but you can kind of make out the word army. The army is full of bad stuff. Way too much rigorous discipline and tyranny and sometimes corruption, too much fanaticism, right? But as long as we get that little bit first, and we often see this in films and documentaries, then afterwards we can still zoom out again and we can say, despite all of that, the army is fantastic. We need it and we're proud of it, and the flag reigns supreme. The same thing can be done with the church for Barth. So, yes, there might be scandals and corruption, but people who are in favor of the church, and Barth certainly is not, because, he, as we said, distrusts institutions. Those people would say, yeah, but you're still looking for salvation. And that's what the church offers, right? And that is what the church is all about. So by focusing first on the bad stuff, we can then move past it and get to what is really important and great. The way this logic works, as we've said, is that the first sign, right? So if we have a sign, let's say x here, normally we would say x equals y. So x means y. The flag means patriotism or something like that. And what we have here is more x equals a little y, right? A little bit of bad stuff, so that you can accept, here we go, so you can accept the big Y. There we go, the big concept. That's really the way in which this particular sign works. As we've said before, whenever we analyze something like this, we also have to analyze Barth himself. Where is he coming from? Why is he making these statements? We know that he's very distrustful of institutions, and it seems that for him, this badness actually seems to spread, right? It's as if the badness makes the whole institution corrupt, and it's hard to look past it. Whereas for others, they can look past it. So by saying, well, it's a vaccine, it's a lot of evil that you're injecting, it's a very negative image right from the start. And I think it's good to be aware of that so that we don't necessarily just accept Barth's perspective here. That leads us to our third topic, which in this case is striptease, a fairly controversial topic. But what Barth is actually saying here is that the way in which this works, the way in which female eroticism operates in a strip club, especially in French society, is surprisingly not sexual. So all of the kind of artificiality of it, all of the feathers and the gloves and the fans and the diamonds and so on, all of the props and decor, all of this actually desexualizes the woman. Okay, so it desexualizes, it takes it away, it desexualizes the woman. And he's got this great quote. He says, "The end of the striptease is then no longer to drag into the light a hidden depth, but to signify, through a shedding of an incongruous and artificial clothing, nakedness as a natural vesture of woman, which amounts in the end to regaining a perfectly chaste state of the flesh." Well, what does that mean? What he's trying to say is that we might think of striptease as something transgressive, but as we've said, there's very little erotic about it. Okay, so not all that erotic, actually. And truth be told, I think you could agree with some of that because these are professionals doing it. They've done it 1,000 times. There's something about it that's not really genuine, right, as you would find in a loving marriage. So there is something about this that is not genuine and kind of fake. And as soon as that happens, we could say, yeah, it's not as erotic as a real kind of love. It's also a fake exoticism. So these dancers, they I guess they're called artists in this context. They want to imitate what is exotic in the way they operate. Barth also talks about what he calls an alibi of art. Okay, so an alibi of art. There we go. And the word alibi literally means elsewhere. So here as well, this is really the striptease pretending to be something else. It pretends to be art, as if it is elsewhere. So you could say sign 1, right? Sign 1 is the striptease here. Pretends to be, claims to be sign 2. And in this case, it's a hollow claim. Sometimes one sign can lead to something else, but here it's definitely a kind of hollow claim. It's not real art. This kind of striptease is also a sport, again, somewhat artificial. And in the end, for Barthes, it becomes a harmless French pastime. It is what he calls nationalized. Everybody does it. All right, it becomes more of a tradition than something truly exotic or exciting. And the point of all of this is that here again we have a kind of inoculation or vaccine. What happens is that the real purpose of striptease is to remove the danger of real female sexuality in order to tame it and to ritualize it. So this becomes a kind of bourgeois strategy where we have striptease, which seems transgressive, but actually just tries to tame the truly transgressive thing, which is true female sexuality, right? Because we don't actually encounter that to the full. In the end, if we go back to our quotation, we see that the body of the woman afterwards seems chaste. And it's as if that chastity has been protected all the way through. Now, this is quite a difficult argument, I would say. We can sketch it out in other ways as well. So we could say that, the stripping is a sign which signifies sexuality, but in a kind of fake way. The artificiality of it removes eroticism. This, in turn, removes the fear of real female sexuality, the taboo, you might say, and all of this leads to a French identity in the end. So it's a very nice kind of flowchart, you might say, about how this works. But do we agree with this, right? Do we actually buy into this? Is this true for everybody? I mean, the professional prostitute, let's say, who has been doing this for a long time, might feel jaded and might find this not erotic at all. Many customers might not. Barthes certainly would fit into that group, I guess. For those who've never been, they might find this the first time, let's say, quite exciting, right? And maybe for the wrong reasons. So it depends a little bit on what perspective you're coming from. And I think one of the key things to think about here is that what Barthes tends to do is he tries to give you a univocal reading. A univocal reading, which is precisely the thing that he rails against. He constantly says that the bourgeois perspective creates a single myth. But he himself tends to create these very simple readings as well. This is the new myth that he shares with us. The sign only means one thing. And one of the biggest things we can learn about signs is that they can point in 100 different directions, right? One sign can mean many things, sometimes many things simultaneously, and sometimes to different people. So signs are actually sometimes more complicated than Barthes gives them credit for, and there's some kind of appeal in his book to the simple explanation. He gives these wonderfully brilliant explanations of what the myths of the culture are, but there's a tendency there as well to simplify and to say this is the actual meaning. All right, so hopefully that allows you to make some sense of these three examples. These are some of the most famous examples, and we'll go on pretty soon to the theory, which you might find more interesting and more applicable in a broader way.